In this lecture, we're going to look at Iran's Islamic Revolution. Iran became a full-fledged theocracy in 1979 when it overthrew its dictatorial leader and replaced him with the Islamic cleric Ayatollah Khomeini. 4 decades later, Iran's president instability is causing some analysts to wonder if another revolution might be around the corner. After this lesson, you'll understand how revolutions in the Middle East spread and what role Western nations have played in these radical shifts of power. It's worth taking a step back, though, and considering the wider history of the region. For example, would you be surprised if you were told that in the 1970s, there was a Muslim nation in the Middle East that fully supported women's rights, universal suffrage, equality under the law, encouraged its youth to study at European universities, and whose leader deeply admired the United States? The country's citizens at this time looked thoroughly modern, well, as modern as you can look in the 1970s, with the same sideburns and short dresses that infested the rest of the world. But for most Westerners, what would surprise them is this description fits Iran. Iran was considered America's strongest ally in the Middle East in the 1970s. My father, who was in the Navy during the Vietnam War, following his discharge, he traveled back to America, but he went east and went through a number of Asian countries and through the Middle East. One of these was Iran, where he spent his most time, because the people there were very pro-Western, and he felt comfortable there, it being a safe and thoroughly modern place. So the question is, what caused this transformation from a country that was considered America's closest ally to recent years when the Iranian regime has been trying to develop nuclear weapons? Its bombastic former president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, speaks frequently about trying to nuke Israel and rattle sabers with America at UN speeches. What caused this transformation? That's what we're going to look at. We have to go back a few decades to the dictatorship of the Shah of Iran, Pahlavi. The key to understanding this paradox is a single event in 1979, the Islamic Revolution. In the space of a few months, the former dictator, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was overthrown and replaced by Ayatollah Khomeini, a religious cleric who quickly turned Iran into an Islamic theocracy. The revolution, however, was decades in the making. Shah Pahlavi slowly assumed dictatorial powers from the beginning of his reign in 1941 until 1953, when Iranians engineered a coup against him, prompting him to flee to Italy. This created problems with the US because the new Iranian regime didn't honor the oil contracts that the US had signed with Pahlavi. As a result, the US and Britain overthrew his democratically elected replacement and reinstated the Shah for 2 reasons. First, because his replacement had nationalized the oil industry. The second was that Iran was considered highly susceptible to falling under Soviet influence. This is something I haven't mentioned yet, but it's an important thing to understand in terms of 20th century Middle Eastern history. In terms of US and Soviet containment in the Cold War in the 20th century, there were many countries in the Middle East that fell under a lot of Soviet sway, while not outright becoming communist states themselves. Countries like Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Egypt had important ties to the Soviet Union and actually received a number of weapons from them. Weapons caches in Syria and Iraq are largely still filled by things produced by the Soviet Union. There's also interesting historical ties, or cultural ties, I should say, between Russia and the Middle East. For example, in the outbreak of the recent Syrian civil war, it was found there were about 30 or 40,000 women, Russian women who lived there who had married Syrian men. This came as a result of these Syrians studying in Russia during the Cold War, when there were many educational opportunities for army officers. And when they would meet someone, get married, and return to their homeland with their new bride in tow. So there's a lot of deep ties between the Soviet Union and the Middle East during the Cold War, and this influences a lot of US decision-making and strategy regarding the Middle East during this time period. The resulting legacy of the US and Britain overthrowing the Shah's replacement for many Iranians, has created a deep resentment against the West for its perceived interference. So why was he overthrown? There's a number of reasons. Iranians harbored deep resentment against Shah Pahlavi, who massively curtailed any political opposition against him. He also created a cult of personality by displaying his own image across the country and showing propaganda films of himself before movies. Not that cults of personality are unique amongst his dictatorship. In fact, that's a mainstay amongst many dictatorships. Some take it to an absurd extreme, like the former prime minister of Turkmenistan, Turkmenbashi, who had days of the week and actual solar constellations renamed after himself and his mother. He also wrote a book of religious verse that was very poorly compiled, but mandatory reading for everyone. All that to say that cults of personality, you'll find them amongst almost any dictatorship. And he also earned enemies from the religious establishment for his aggressive secularization policies and embrace of Israel. Most notably amongst his opponents was the religious cleric Ayatollah Khomeini, whom the Shah sent into exile. Together, these factors led to massive demonstrations against the Shah in 1978, culminating in a December protest in which 2 million people filled Tehran streets and demanded the Shah's deposition and Khomeini's return. When Khomeini arrived in February 1979, he toppled the government in a week and declared Iran a theocracy. Unfortunately, many Western analysts and policymakers, while Khomeini was in exile, called for him to return as a move toward Iran embracing democracy and a free trade of ideas. Well, obviously it didn't turn out that way. So where is Iran now? Today, the most powerful politician in Iran is the supreme leader, which was Khomeini until his death in 1989, and Ali Khamenei since then. He and his council vet all politicians for a high office. Their official responsibility is to, quote, protect the state's Islamic character, unquote. The former president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, he's gained notoriety for his bizarre performances at meetings of the United Nations. For example, at one opening of the assembly, he gave a speech, and in closing, he called on God to bring the world to an end, and he's also hosted conferences that question the Holocaust. He's ultimately, or was ultimately, under the thumb of the supreme leader. That's why Ahmadinejad, who happens to hold the supreme leader's favor, was declared the winner of the 2009 presidential election despite widespread suspicions of fraud, which led to the Green Revolution and massive protests in Iran, and also a lot of deaths of protesters and many people thrown into political prisons. The ensuing protests against these election results by millions in Iran and around the world was brutally suppressed or flatly ignored by Iranian authorities. Many Westerners see these tensions as the harbinger of an impending power shift and wonder if Iran is set for another revolution. Well, Iran's character today might surprise you. In addition to these internal strains, external pressures have also begun to mount. The UN has placed heavy sanctions on Iran for its uranium enrichment programs that are perceived as a foil for the development of nuclear weapons, and the sanctions have crippled its economy. It's still able to keep afloat because of its massive petroleum development, but things are steadily getting worse for your average Iranian. And another interesting fact that most people don't know about Iran is that the population of Iran is extremely young and increasingly secular. The late political theorist Samuel Huntington, who wrote the controversial book The Clash of Civilizations, who argued that in the wake of the Cold War, now that there are two superpowers contending with one another, the major confrontations in the 21st century will be culturally based and largely between cultural blocs like the Middle East and the West. Many scholars, particularly those in the Middle East, criticize him for this because they don't like a political theory that seems to teleologically lead to tension and take a culture in a region with hundreds of millions of people who are very diverse and label them with Middle East or label them with West. All that to say, something he has said that was interesting was that amongst all the Middle Eastern nations, Iran is the only one where children are more secular than their parents. In many cases, it's actually quite the opposite. I mentioned in the previous lecture, or a few lectures ago, about Arab nationalism being replaced by political Islamism. So in nations like Turkey or Egypt or Iraq, your average person is most likely much more religious than their father or even their grandfather. However, this is the opposite case in Iran, where the youth are very secular. Iran has one of the highest use rates of drug usage in the world. And I've had the chance to meet many Iranians through Persian studies, but also here in Turkey, there's a number who've come here for refugees. And there are many people who are fed up with the theocratic regime. There are lots of political refugees from Iran. Some of the people, for example, the LGBT community, gays and lesbians, some have been executed in Iran. So some have fled for that reason. Baha'is, who are under heavy religious persecution, have fled. Converts to Christianity from Islam and other marginalized groups. But not just those who are under political pressure, many rank and file Iranians have a deep dislike of the theocracy. So what all that is to say is Iran from 10 years from now, there are mounting tensions suggesting an impending power shift. If that happens, perhaps Iran could go to another revolution. We don't know what would replace it, if it would be anarchy, Islamic militants as we're seeing in Iraq today, or perhaps something that could resemble a wobbly democracy. All that to say, it is within the realm of possibility that the Iran of 10 years from now might not look all that different from its 1970s self, hopefully minus all the sideburns and bell-bottoms. Okay, in the next lecture, we're going to look at some of the recent attempts in the last couple of decades to forge a peace between Jews and Muslims in Israel. Has it succeeded? Well, yes and no. We'll unpack that a little bit more next time. Thanks for listening.